should we go about investigating this?
Well, obviously, you have to gather all of the data. It has been impounded at this point. There'll have to be a lot of studies, but there are some superbly qualified experts in this area that I think will be able to determine what the failure was.
Senator, you were on board the space shuttle. You felt that tremendous boost that you got. Now, from the telemetry that we heard, the voice data that we heard, they had just told the pilot to go to full throttle, and he had said he was throttling up. What happens at that moment?
You have a combination of the solid rocket booster power and liquid hydrogen and oxygen in the main tank. And because most of your thrust comes from the solid rocket boosters, while you're still in the atmosphere, you can exceed the maximum dynamic pressure. So the main engines are only at about 60% of power until you get further out of the atmosphere. And they had just been given the command to throttle up, and then you go to 104% or maximum power on the solids, or on the liquids. And so that is exactly what had taken place. They were high enough so they would not endanger the orbiter from too much pressure, and were given that order that they could proceed to increase the power.
What are some of the things that can go wrong at that moment?
Well, you have a very large external tank of very volatile liquid hydrogen and oxygen. And you're just simply, it's like in an automobile, you are putting more fuel. You're pushing down on the accelerator, you're putting more fuel to bring more power. And of course, at this point, we don't know whether it was one of the solids, we don't know whether it was the liquid engines or not. There's just no way to know at this point.
What was your opinion of the amount of missions that NASA had scheduled for this year? Do you think that they were capable of going ahead with 14 or 15 safely?
Yes, I think so. The major problem these last couple of missions has been weather, and that is something that NASA cannot control. But yes, I think the program was mature enough that, and with the opening of the second pad, Pad B, which Challenger was launched from this morning, with 2 pads and also the addition of the 4th orbiter. Yes, I think they were capable of that schedule.
Do you think it's going to make any difference to civilians in space from now on?
Well, I can't judge what decisions NASA will make, but my own opinion, again, after the investigations, we should proceed with the program, and that would include the civilians in space program as well.
As a civilian yourself going in, were you adequately warned that something like this could happen?
Oh, of course. The training is very thorough and very adequate. In my own case, having flown more than 10,000 hours, I was certainly aware that there are dangers in flying. However, I still feel very strongly that I'm much safer in flying an aircraft than any day that I'm on the Capital Beltway, and I don't mean that to be facetious at all. We kill nearly 50,000 people a year on the in the highways of this country, because of half of them because of drunk driving. I wish we'd pay a lot more attention to that.
Senator, should there have been some way for them, or was there any way for them to get out at this point? Should there have been?
No, I don't think so. In Columbia originally, during the test phase, when just they were sending 2 test pilots up, they did have an escape capsule. The program had been proved safe enough, in my opinion, that they didn't need them in the other orbiters, and Columbia had been modified so that it did not have the escape mechanism in it. This is purely my opinion, but in watching what happened this morning, I would doubt very much, even if you had had an escape capsule on board or parachutes, that it would have been possible to get out with that kind of an explosion in any event.
Senator, in light of all of the delays surrounding recent shuttles and this one, do you think that NASA may have been too anxious to get this one off the ground?
No, I was down on Saturday and for the launch on Sunday morning, and they were criticized on Sunday for being overly careful. Safety has always been foremost in their minds. And we woke up on Sunday morning after having canceled at 10 o'clock the night before to a perfect morning. It was beautiful, sunny, clear blue skies, perfect launch, and there was a lot of talk that rather irritated me. Well, NASA was overly cautious. And so, no, I don't think that's true at all.
What happens in your subcommittee now in terms of funding for the program?
Well, I can't answer that question exactly because of Graham Rudman and the other budget constraints, but I certainly have no intentions other than to push on, and that does not change the intent or the progress of the program.
How do you think the investigation ought to be handled, Senator? Should there be some sort of blue ribbon panel put together, or should NASA be allowed to handle it?
Well, I think NASA has the technical experts, and if they need more than in-house, they will pull them in. I don't think we need to go outside that other than to draw on consultants if necessary. NASA is so thorough and so careful. If any of you had experienced how they go through the redundancy and the backups and careful nature, the dedication of these scientists and engineers in NASA, I have full faith in them. They want the program to succeed. They want to take care of their astronauts. It's always a real team effort. They work closely together, and they will want to find out what happened more than anybody else.
Senator, how lucky do you feel today that you returned safely?
That's
Well,
Senator Jake Garn, who's been recalling his mission and commenting on this morning's tragedy over the Kennedy Space Center, the explosion in mid-flight of the Challenger. Senator Garn, as you know, was America's first senator in space, having flown aboard Discovery in April of 1985. And the senator is recounting his flight and discussing what was happening to him and his feelings about things. Tom and Tier again in Atlanta.
Read, the picture you're seeing behind me is the seas off the shores of the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, where the rescue efforts have been going on now for well over an hour. It took almost 1 hour before they could bring those crews into the area because for that time period, the debris from the exploded shuttle was still falling. CNN's John Zarella is at the Kennedy Space Center and maybe has an update for us. John?
Tom, as you just said, it was falling for about an hour after the explosion. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Nicholson of the Department of Defense just told us that the debris was falling from at least 50,000 feet, and that he doubted that that was the top altitude where debris was falling from. It was the range safety officer who was in charge, who through radar and monitoring this falling debris made the determination not to allow recovery ships and vehicles into the area until they were sure that all the debris had finally fallen into the water. At the present time, there are 2 H-3 helicopters now being handled by the Department of Defense, with the chief man in charge of the operation on board one of those helicopters. I do not have his name. There is the one C-130 aircraft in the area. There is one SRB recovery ship. Of course, that is the ship that would recover those solid rocket boosters once they have fallen back into the water. There is one Coast Guard hydrofoil on the scene. 2 more H-3 helicopters, Coast Guard helicopters out of Clearwater, Florida, are on their way to the scene, and one Coast Guard cutter from Grand Bahama is making its way at top speed to the rescue, to the recovery area. At this point, again, they have had no word, according to Lieutenant Colonel Robert Nicholson, from the recovery scene as to what, if anything, they have found there. He says that it may be another hour before they have any more information from the recovery scene, from those ships and helicopters that are in the area right now. Tom?
John, is there any indication that Challenger was veering off course? It was very difficult to tell from the picture here, but you were there. Are you hearing anything about the possibility that it was heading off course and maybe going back over toward inhabited land areas?
Nothing at all, Tom. I was standing right out on the edge of the water looking out at the launch pad, and of course, when it took off on that trajectory, it seemed to be making a perfect ascent right up until the moment of the explosion. And there's been so much speculation in the past hour and 36 minutes. The clock's still running on out on the pad. That perhaps at throttle back, that the SRBs they went up to 204%, suddenly increasing in the velocity of the SRBs, and of course that the shuttle cannot handle that. But that is just all such speculation at this point, and that they couldn't throttle them back. But again, so much speculation here as to what may or may not have happened. The one thing that everybody is certain of at this point is that after that explosion, another piece of the shuttle, whatever it might have been, whether it was a rocket or whether it was the orbiter itself, continued on apparently. And no one, of course, knows what happened at that point. At least no one is saying. But again,
All right.
it's going to be about an hour, Tom.
All right, John, we'll wait for word back from you from the Kennedy Space Center. For those of you who may have just joined us, tragedy in the skies over Florida this morning at 11:39 a.m., 1 minute after liftoff. Challenger exploded in a ball of fire. There appears to have killed all 7 crew members, including the first private citizen in space, school teacher Christa McAuliffe.
7, 6.
This is a replay of the launch of Challenger, main engines igniting and lifting away from pad 39B, the first time that pad had been used in 10 years since the Apollo program. The second pad would have allowed NASA to keep its ambitious schedule of 15 launches this year.
Confirmed. Challenger now heading downrange.
The large brown object you see in the center of your screen is the external tank which holds the volatile fuel.
Normal throttles for most of the flight, 104%.
The white tubes are the solid rocket boosters, one on each side of that brown tank.
Shortly.
And the shuttle in this position sits below it.
Engines at 65%, 3 engines running normally, 3 good fuel cells, 3 good APUs.
When the explosion occurred, everything seemed to be attached. The solid rockets were not scheduled to separate for several more minutes.
Engines throttling up, 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
Roger, go at throttle up.
That's the last words.
1 minute, 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
The twin contrails of white smoke going away from the huge fireball. The solid rocket continuing to burn as it heads toward the landing point in the ocean. Here's a slow motion replay. Now you see fire right between the space shuttle and the external tank. There are no engines there. No reason for fire to be there. And then it explodes. Shuttle still visible. Now it's gone. There were spectators watching at the Kennedy Space Center at the time, taking photographs. In this picture you're about to see here now, no indication of any problem. This is probably about 30 seconds into the flight. Christa McAuliffe's school children. You hear the yell of anticipation, the glee, the happiness that would soon change. The cries of, oh no. There you see Christa McAuliffe's parents, Ed and Grace Corrigan, from Framingham, Massachusetts. They stood silently during the launch. At this point, no one really realized what had happened. Just that there was a large puff of white smoke and an explosion in the sky. Those who had never witnessed a launch before probably not realizing a NASA official climbed a couple of rows into the bleachers to where Christa McAuliffe's parents were standing, walked up and said to them, the vehicle has exploded. A stunned Mrs. Corrigan looked back at them and repeated the words as a question. The vehicle has exploded. He nodded silently, and then the realization of what had happened swept across Mr. and Mrs. Corrigan's face. Disbelief at first. Christa McAuliffe's parents, Ed and Grace Corrigan, watching as Challenger was in flight for 1 minute and then exploded in a huge fireball. It appears that there were no survivors.